Welcome back to the channel, everyone. My name's Clinton Jones, and over the last 5 years, I've been learning Unreal Engine with a focus on moody, photoreal environments running in real time. Now, if you follow Unreal Engine news, then you might have seen this amazing demo showcasing the power of their real-time, procedurally generated environments. It's been 1.5 years since that video, and I just never found the time or the reason to learn until today. This video is gonna be a whopper, because by the end, you're gonna have all the info, tips, tricks, and resources to build your own procedural open world environment in Unreal Engine 5. We're covering everything from inspiration to final render. I'm gonna show you how I capture and process custom photo scans in Reality Capture. Then we're gonna dive into the wonderful world of procedurally generated content in Unreal Engine, where I'll show you a bunch of different ways to scatter grass, flowers, trees, bushes, and our custom scan ruins to ultimately recreate the ancient city of Pompeii. All procedural, all real time. We got tons of stuff to cover, so let's get started. With why Pompeii, of all places? So my wife and I visited Italy back in May for our 2nd anniversary, and Pompeii, located in southern Italy, was hands down one of our favorite spots. Despite the volcanic eruption in 79 AD that wiped out the town and all the people in it, I was blown away by the beauty of this place, and just the fact that it was dug up and excavated blew my mind. It felt like I was in a Zelda game, surrounded by 2,000-year-old ruins, nestled in fields of vibrant flowing grass. The place is just downright magical, and I knew that this was an environment that I had to create. So that means I took a bunch of reference images of this place. And on top of that, I knew I had to start photo scanning stuff, because Pompeii isn't Pompeii without these old food pots, the frescoes, the unique brickwork, these ancient flour mills and broken pillars. But there was one big problem. The town was blasted by direct sun the entire time, which makes photo scanning really difficult. If you've ever done it before, you know that overcast lighting is the way to go, because what you shoot is what you get. The lighting is baked in. But I found my workarounds and captured in the few shady areas that I can find in the very little time I had. So let me show you my on-the-fly capture process. With photogrammetry, our goal is to capture tack-sharp, high megapixel images of our subject regardless of its size from all possible angles. Now, since we were walking all day, every day on this trip, I left my DSLR at home, and normally this would be a problem because my DSLR shoots those high megapixel raw images that we need for a great scan. But since my iPhone 15 shoots 24 megapixels and shoots raw images, allowing us to delight in post, I decided to give it a try. You can enable the raw settings on your iPhone like this and toggle it when shooting right up here. Just don't forget to turn it off when you're done. Imagine this. You're in a dark void with a flash connected to your camera, and every image you capture reveals a small piece of your object. And your goal is to capture all the images necessary to completely reveal that object. Now, there's a handful of different capture techniques out there, but the one I like to use for capturing this object would just be the 360 method. Basically, just do a bunch of circles around the object, taking pictures as you go. Once you complete a ring, raise or lower your camera and shoot out another until you got the whole thing. And don't forget the little crevices too if your object has any. While capturing, you want to keep 2 things in mind. Image overlap, which we have plenty of since we can see most of our object in frame for every shot, and image clarity. Blurry images will only screw up your final scan by either making it super lumpy, chunky, or just plain old not even what is that? I have no idea. So keep a steady hand and consider downloading a third-party photo app that lets you control shutter speed, white balance, all that stuff. Ideally, it's all set to manual. The second technique is used for long walls, sidewalks, or large frescoes in this case. It's called the stereo pair technique. Think about it. Stereo, right? Left and right ears, and a pair, right? 2 makes a pair. So we're shooting a total of 4 from the same place, focused on one single point. 1 left, 1 right, that's the first pair, then 1 high and 1 low, our second pair, stereo pair. Now just step over and repeat this process. Now, this technique ensures that we always have enough overlap in an image for every angle of our flat-ish surface. Have fun with it, scan to your heart's content, and build out your personalized asset library. I got a playlist linked below to all of my photogrammetry videos for you to take a look at later. So let's process these images before we run it through reality capture, because we want to de-light our images to ensure the final 3D asset can be used in as many lighting conditions as possible. And since we shot raw, it'll be super easy to flatten out our image, unify the white balance, lift the shadows, dim the highlights. On top of that, I'll do a little bit of denoising and a touch of sharpening, then copy paste these changes across all the images and save them at their original resolution in a processed folder. Now here's where everything comes together, where we align and mesh our images into a custom 3D asset, and I'll be doing it in a program called Reality Capture, the sponsor of today's video. Now, Reality Capture is what the Quixel team uses to make all of those super sweet Megascans assets, and it's been my go-to photogrammetry software for the last 8 years. But now, it's part of the Epic Games ecosystem and free to use for artists making less than $1 million per year, which is basically all of us here. Back at Corridor, we used Reality Capture a whole bunch, like in the first Boss Town Dynamics video, when the real box turns into a Photoscan, and I've used Reality Capture to scan the smallest assets to the biggest, and everything in between. People have scanned entire cities with this thing, and even Mars. Mars, what the heck? That's crazy. And it's free for you to use and follow along with me right now. So here's what I'm asking you guys to do. Download these 2 Pompeii Ruins datasets that I have linked in the description below, as well as the Epic Games launcher, where you can launch Reality Capture and follow along with me. Just to preface here that I'm gonna show you guys all the best manual settings to plug in here to process your images in Reality Capture. I got the thumbs up from the guys over there on this workflow, and I wanna share all the little tips and tricks to getting the highest fidelity scans. So let's get started. First, I'll just change my viewport up here. Then we can drag our processed images into the viewport, which gets loaded in on the side right over here. We can drop this down to see all of our images. Nice. Workflow-wise, if we click on this first workflow tab, our step-by-step is kind of laid out for us. First, we import our images, which we just did. Second, we align our images to create a point cloud, mesh our point cloud, and finally texture our mesh. And third and finally, we export our custom 3D asset to be used in any 3D program that we want. View is for all the UI stuff, and tools we'll get into throughout this photogrammetry process. Now, if you look at our image list in 1DS View, you'll notice this little waypoint down the line here. And that means the images come with GPS data, which Reality Capture can use to better align our images. This is a good thing if the GPS data is accurate to the centimeter, to the millimeter even, but unfortunately our phones and prosumer drones don't come close to that level of accuracy. So we need to turn it off so that Reality Capture doesn't confuse this bad GPS data for good GPS data, ultimately screwing up our alignment. So I'll just select all our images with Control A, then under Prior Pose, I'll set the absolute pose to unknown, which successfully removes the bad GPS data from the equation. Now we can go back to the Workflow tab and click Align Images. And after a minute, we get this point cloud of our flower mill. You can zoom in with the scroll wheel, you can right click to orbit and left click to pan. But let's straighten this thing out. Under the Tools tab, let's click Set Ground Plane, and if you look hard enough, you'll find this little gizmo, and we'll just eyeball it in. Then you can use your numpad to change to your 2D views and just go through and get it as close as you can. If you hold your pointer further from the gizmo while rotating, it won't be as difficult. And to move the gizmo, just double click on a spot. I'll just center this up to the origin, marked by this thin, faint black line. Hitting 0 on the numpad will get you back to 3D view. But hey, look at that, we got a visual representation of each photo we took, showing off that 360 technique really well. But let's hide them because they're quite noisy by clicking the View tab and under Alignment Cameras, unchecking Enabled. Now if you don't see your entire object, chances are it got split up into various components, and that's because Reality Capture either didn't have enough images, they were too blurry, or there wasn't enough visual overlap to accurately align the whole object. Which means you gotta shoot more photos or manually add control points to better define the shape of your object to the computer. And I go over that whole control point troubleshooting workflow in this video here if you need it. Now it's time to turn our point cloud into a mesh. So under the Tools tab, I'll just click Set Reconstruction Region, and we just can use these little handles to work it into place. And making use of those 2D views helps a bunch with this as well. Now let's go to the Mesh Model tab and click Reconstruct in Normal Detail. Your computer's gonna think super hard for a sec, then spit out a high poly, detailed reconstruction of a Pompeian flour mill. So cool. Let's cut away the polygons that we don't want by going to the Tools tab and selecting the Lasso Selection tool. I'll click and drag around this unwanted base, holding Control to continue adding the selection until I make it all the way around, and then just hit Filter Selection right up top here. But we still have these big triangles down below, and they're called marginal triangles. You can either select them and filter them again, or click on this Advanced button, and you can have Reality Capture select all the marginal triangles in one swoop, which you can then filter away. And every time we filter away a mesh, by the way, a new mesh is made, so we can always go back to our older meshes if needed. So what we're gonna do now is texture our 5 million polygon mesh, then simplify it to something like 1 million polygons, then reproject the high detailed texture onto the low poly mesh. They do this a whole bunch in games to optimize for performance, and it's the best way to process these high poly scans. So under the Mesh Model tab, let's click Settings, which will open up our texture settings down here. There's only two things we want to change here for best results. For both unwrap style and texture style, we want to choose mosaic based. Takes a little bit longer, but it yields the highest fidelity results. Then we'll just hit texture. Oh, this looks so good. Yes, lots of detail in this texture. It looks super nice. Now next, let's simplify this mesh by going to the Tools tab, clicking on Simplify, where we can change the poly count to 1 million, and hit Simplify. And it looks a bit crunchy here, but fear not, that high quality texture reprojection is gonna make things better. First, we have to unwrap our new simplified mesh. So same as last time, let's go to the Mesh Model tab, click Unwrap, and make sure it's set to mosaic based and let it rip. Now we can reproject by going to the Tools tab and selecting Texture Reprojection. Just make sure your source model is your high poly mesh and your result model is the simplified one we just made. Notice it's going to make a color texture and a normal map. Yes, that's exactly what we want. Let's do it. Beautiful. It doesn't look janky anymore because the reprojection was successful. All right, now let's finally export this thing. So I'll just click the logo on the top left and hit Export. We'll choose Autodesk FBX and confirm we're exporting the textures, both the color and the normal, as well as choosing the program we're using this in, which will adjust the scale and flip any gizmos if needed. But sweet, we got a really nice looking first century wheat mill asset that we can use in the environment that we're about to build together. The more you scan, the more unique your 3D renders will feel. And be the weird guy on vacation who can't go 5 steps without capturing an ancient food pot, various village walls and frescoes, little column thingies, a crusty old door, a pile of rotten books, your tea set, a mountain, another mountain, burnt down buildings, more burnt down buildings, random stuff, and this penguin. All of which you can find and download on my Patreon if you want to help support the channel and more videos like this. But my friends, it is time to build a lush procedural field for our custom scans to live in, all inside of Unreal Engine 5. Back in the Epic Games Launcher, under the Library tab, we can see our various versions of Unreal Engine here. Let's launch and set up our project. I'll go ahead and select the Games category with a blank level preset, name your file, and let's open it on up. To navigate, you're going to hold right click and use your WASD keys to fly around. Q and E will raise and lower the camera. The G key will show and hide icons. F will snap your view to any selected object. The spacebar will cycle through your position, scale, and rotation gizmos, or you can use W, E, and R to choose the exact gizmo you want. Control backtick will swap between world and local orientation, and you can press Control spacebar in any window to bring up your content browser. Now the PCG workflow in Unreal Engine is actually pretty simple. It all starts with a PCG volume that spawns points randomly across a landscape. We filter those points down with a combination of unique filter nodes, then assign any number of meshes to those points. And when we move the volume, the points procedurally update to the landscape it spawned on. We build the environmental rule set. Unreal takes care of the rest. And our goal as artists is to scatter points in a way that resembles how this grass is scattered, how these wildflowers are scattered, these trees, these ruins, and layer them all together to ultimately capture the likeness of this environment, or even this environment. You can use PCG to create buildings, scatter cities, and the use cases are limitless. There's a lot of cool channels doing PCG stuff that I'm going to get into a little bit later if you guys want to learn more. I hope that helps give you guys an idea of why this is so exciting for me. So let's jump in and do this. The first step is to spawn some points, but first we need to have a landscape for them to spawn on. So by switching to the landscape layout on the top left here, I'll make a 7x7 and hit create. Then use the brush tools to add some hills and detail and whatnot. Now alternatively, you can use a program like GeoGen to create a custom height map that you can then load in for more realistic results. Feel free to download the one I'm using in the description below. Next, I'll make a PCG graph by right-clicking in the content browser, navigating to PCG and selecting PCG graph. Name it what you want and drag it into your scene. Now this volume is going to house all of our points and ultimately our procedural environment. With the PCG volume selected, you'll notice this Generate and Cleanup button. Let's hit Generate, which appears to do nothing, but don't worry, it worked. We just need to double click our PCG volume and set up two quick things. First, let's right click and select Get Landscape Data, because Unreal needs to know where the landscape is, right? And second, from the Get Landscape, I'll make a surface sampler, because Unreal also needs to know where to spawn those points. And lastly, to view our points, I'll select our surface sampler and hit D for debug. And hey, look at that, we got points. Now let's turn these points into some lush green grass. So imagine for a sec that each one of these points represents a Quixel Megascans grass patch. We're gonna need a lot more points if we wanna fill out this field. So let's select our surface sampler and increase the points per squared meter. Now at first, that works, but eventually, no matter how high we crank this number, Unreal won't overlap these points here, so we'll need to lower our point extents to make room for more points. And now we're getting something. We can always come back to adjust these numbers, but from here, it's just a game of filtering these source points down in an artistic way to shape our scene. So what's next? Yeah, we could just slap a grass mesh on this right now and call it a day, but let's try and mimic the way nature spreads grass, which I think is gonna start off in really tall clumps and then spread out to the barren patchy areas where the grass is usually shortest. And we can use a spatial noise node to replicate this. Just be sure to debug it again by hitting D on your keyboard. But because the noise pattern is so big, we can't really see it. So let's increase the tiling here and set it to something like 20. And hey, look at that, that's exactly what we want. Now if we can only scale these white points up and the black points down, let's make an execute blueprint node, and under the blueprint element type, I'll select scale by density. Density is just the 0 to 1 random values of these black and white points, and all the grayscale values in between. And if we set our min and max values to something like 1 and 2, it works. But check it, if we added a mesh to these points now, they'd all be facing the same direction. So let's debug a transform points node where we can add a 360-degree random z-axis rotation, some random scale variation, and even some small positional XY offset. Just be cautious not to go too far on the offset, you'll slide them straight off your landscape, and that's no good. And now it's time to attach some grass to these points with a static mesh spawner node. For grass assets, you can use any ones you like, of course, but if you click the add content box right up here and click on Quixel Bridge, you get unlimited access to literally every asset in here for free. You can build just about any environment you can imagine with these. Just search for wild grass, download some cool ones, and transfer the nanite meshes to your scene. Then in the static mesh spawner where it says mesh entries, I'll click the plus button to add an element, unfurl the index and descriptor, then either search the database for my mesh or just drag it into this box here. And hey, look at that, we got a field. Definitely add more grass meshes for variation, and Unreal will randomly assign a certain percentage of those points to each of the meshes that you plug in here for variety. From here, you'll probably want to make some adjustments for both aesthetics and performance. I'll click the menu icon in my viewport and show FPS. If that's crunchy already, you can drop the points per squared meter in our surface sampler to help performance, or you can add a density filter to the very front of your grass setup. And if we detach our grass mesh by alt-clicking its connection and debug that density filter, you can see what's going on. By default, it's cutting away half of our dark points, and we can work both of these sliders to filter out any amount of points that we want. So I'll just cut the bottom 25%. Ideally, we want to use the minimum amount of points, or meshes, to create our scene, right? Because it can get pretty heavy pretty quick, especially with grass since there's so much of it. Now let's clean it up aesthetically. In our content browser, I'll select the all folder and search for character, then drag them out so we have a better sense of the grass's scale. To fill in the patchy bits, I'll scale up the min-max values in our scale by density setup, then finally select all our grass nodes, hit C to comment, and call it grass. And look at that, we got a lush, grassy field, and since it's procedural, our environment automatically adapts to any spot on the landscape that it's spawned on. But we're only getting started because we need to add some trees. I'm seeing two types from our reference image, the Italian cypress and the Italian pine, both of which I saw all over Italy, and without these, it's just a random generic field 01. So let's start with the cypress. I'll alt-click the grass from the mesh to disconnect it, just so we can see what's going on. I'll copy the spatial noise node over, connect it to the surface sampler, which again is generating our source points that we set up earlier, and debug it. We want groups of trees, and spatial noise is a great way to simulate that. Let's just scale the texture up a bit. Yeah, that'll be nice. Density filters are great. I'm gonna use them all the time throughout this video, and let's use it on this until we have these little islands of points. Nice, but that would still be too many trees. So let's add an attribute noise node and debug it. This essentially re-rolls the random value amount across your points, allowing us to connect a new density filter node to filter this down to a reasonable amount. And before we connect our mesh, let's go straight into a transform points node to add those 360 degrees of z-axis rotation and a little bit of random scale. And finally into a static mesh spawner where I'll hook up 3 or 4 different types of Italian cypress trees. But yo, the scale is way off, so let's adjust it in our transform points node. And since trees almost always point straight up, let's check this absolute rotation box to straighten them out. Group your cypress tree nodes by hitting C, and feel free to make adjustments to your tree density. Move the volume around, watch it update to your landscape, change the seed maybe, and get different looks. It's really, really fun. I hope you guys are having a good time so far. Let's add our last tree, the Italian pine. So I'll simply just copy paste our cypress tree setup, connect it to our surface sampler, and swap out the meshes for a handful of different pine trees. But since we copied our cypress setup, we literally have a tree inside of every tree. So let's disconnect both trees for a second and debug our first density filter over here. I essentially want to invert this, so we'll never have trees within trees. So I'll click invert, and I'll drop the lower bounds to 0.3. Then let's debug our second density filter and crank this down even harder, because I want these trees to be a lot more sparse in our environment. Again, based off of our reference image. Let's connect the meshes back up, tweak the scale in the transform points node, and we got our trees locked in. All right, we're fully in now. Let's level up. I want to spawn some bushes around our field. Easy enough, right? But I also want to spawn bushes around every pine tree, and the closer they are to the pine trees, the larger I want them to be. As if the big ones were spawning baby ones, right? Just like in our reference. So let's debug a distance node, which compares our target pine tree points to the source surface sampler points, and lets us control the radius of effect by lowering the max distance value. Now let's use our prior knowledge to lock in these bushes. I'll use a density filter node to filter out the points furthest from the tree. Next, let's shrink the points furthest from the tree with an execute blueprint node set to scale by density. You may need to invert your min-max scale values here. I'll plug in an attribute noise to re-roll our salt and pepper, filter that down to a reasonable amount of bushes, run that out to a transform points node for random rotation and scale, and finally to a static mesh spawner with our bushes, which I'm just using a small pine tree asset for. But now that we have a mesh plugged in and our rules set up, you'll want to play with these settings to lock it in. First, I want to drop the trees into the ground so they look more like bushes. I'll just adjust the Z offset in the transform points node to do this. From here, it's a back and forth between your density filter to decide how many bushes are surrounding your trees, your min-max scale values to get the right feel, and how far your bushes spawn from the tree with the max distance. When you're done tweaking, group everything together, and let's move on to the random bushes scattered around the field. I'll just pull off of our distance node that we set up a second ago and into a density filter to access the points not under the trees. Then I'll go into some spatial noise to generate groups of points, into another density filter to make them islands, into some attribute noise to re-roll that salt and pepper, another density filter cranked high for our bushes points, straight into the transform points node of our last bush setup, and bam, we got field bushes too. God, I love PCG so much. It's super empowering, very inspiring. I hope you guys are still with me. I hope you're having a good time. Now, before we scatter some of those Photoscan ruins around our lush field, it won't be complete without vibrant wildflowers, because they're a big reason Pompeii felt so darn beautiful. Alright, so let's go from the surface sampler into a spatial noise set to caustic 2D, because it looks smeary and windswept. Work with your tiling a bit before hitting it with a density filter to isolate those point islands. And since I want smaller flower clusters within our big clusters, let's copy paste these two nodes, link into them, and increase the tiling in the second spatial noise. See how it creates these little tiny islands within the bigger ones? I love this look. I think this is going to be great. Let's re-roll our salt and pepper with an attribute noise node into a density filter for our final flower points. Then through a transform points node for random size and rotation, and straight into the static mesh spawner with a handful of Quixel flowers. Yes, this looks great. From here, let's reconnect our grass to see how they all play together. You may need to scale your flowers up a bit so they peek through. Pro tip here, for better optimization of your setup, you can remove the grass where the flowers are, since the flowers kind of come with grass in their mesh. To do this, I'll pull off of the grass's transform node into a source slot of a distance node, and the target will be the transform node for our flowers. Then if we toggle set density in our distance node and drop the max distance to 0, we'll target just our flower points, which we can filter out with a density filter. Then plug that into the grass mesh and we buy back some performance. And look at this, we have a beautiful Italian field built procedurally around a pretty straightforward set of rules. Now what's crazy about Pompeii is that it was built very similar to our cities today. It's got streets and alleys that cut between homes, shops, and city squares. So our goal is to find a way to create unique procedural chunks of scattered ruins, and we're going to do it in 2 layers. The first layer will be a foundational grid built from free assets from the Quixel Megascans library, topped off with the photoscans I took in Pompeii. And for the second layer, we'll scatter an assortment of custom scanned artifacts, pots, and pillars across our field. Alright, so let's start with our ancient ruins grid. I'll pull straight off the surface sampler into a density filter and filter this way down, because each one of these points is going to represent a whole cluster of ruins, and I want them to be a little snack, not the whole meal. Now I want to spawn a grid of points around each one of these points. So let's make a create points grid node, and you'll notice it doesn't have an in, only an out. So we'll need a copy points node to bridge these together. Our source points go into source, and our target points go into the grid. Now, if you don't see any points, select your distance node and uncheck the call points outside volume box. But this is good, we're headed in the right direction. We got a grid of points spawned around these filtered points, right? So to fix this clipping issue, I'll just make a projection node with the target plugged into our original landscape node that we made at the beginning.
And if you're still having trouble seeing your points, you can add a bounds modifier to rescale them.
Perfect. Now let's just use a transform points node for a bit of random rotation and scale, and add some blocky ruins from the Megascans library to our static mesh spawner. But shoot, this doesn't work. This is not a grid. The random rotation from the transform points node is screwing up our grid pattern. And even if we set it to 90-degree angles, they're all set to the same angle. I want to randomly rotate these ruins, but snapped to 90-degree increments. How the heck can we do that? I had the same question, so shoutouts to Sensei Steve for this clever workaround. First, let's re-roll that salt and pepper across all of our points with an attribute noise node. From here, we're going to use a density filter to only show points in the 0 to 0.25 range, and give those a random rotation of 0. Let's do it again, but filter everything except 0.2501 to 0.5 with a random rotation of 90 degrees in both the min and max slots. And again, for the 0.501 to 0.75 range, rotating at 180, and our final filter of 0.7501 to 1, rotating at 270 degrees. And if we have the attribute noise plugged into all of the filters, and all the transforms plugged into our meshes, we get a nice assortment of ancient ruins rotated randomly on 90-degree increments across a grid. Perfect. This is why this is so satisfying. It's like you have to think hard about how to make it work technically, and it pays off in a visual, creative way. If you have a simpler way of doing this though, please let me know in the comments down below. I'll make sure to pin it. Now let's add to this. I'm going to go one step further with a second layer of scanned ruins from Per Bellerson over on CG Trader. I'll just pull off of the attribute noise from earlier, filter that down a bit further, put that straight into our 90-degree setup into a spawner with the new meshes. And since these scans are larger, I'll select all the transform nodes and offset them into the ground. So we have this flour mill scan from earlier, and this ancient pot for serving food, and I want to place them in these ruins. Since they're kitchen appliances, that's where the Romans probably would have been using them, in their homes, in their shops, right? Since each of these ruins clusters were based off of a single point, we'll pull from that original filter into an attribute noise, into a density filter, because I feel like it's more realistic if only like 75% of the ruins had these kitchen appliances, you know? Then throw that into a transform points node, 360 degrees of random rotation, little XY offset so they're not all smack in the middle of the ruins, and yes, beautiful, beautiful. And scatter whatever the heck else you want inside of these ruins, like ancient tools, ancient oh yes, pots, yes. Look at this reference, these pots are everything. They're what makes this feel like Hyrule Field or something. But I wasn't able to scan any pots while I was in Pompeii. Yeah, I could buy an asset or something, but I really do love scanning. So luckily, while I was waiting for a burger in the In-N-Out line, I spotted this place. And the owner Farhat let me scan some of his old looking pots. I processed them in reality capture, and I think they'll work perfectly for our scene. I'll start with a double spatial noise setup like we did for the flowers to get these clusters of points,
and use this distance node setup to keep them from clipping through our ruins.
And I'll point the target at the trees too, since we don't want pots and stumps. I'll re-roll our random values and filter that down, because lots of pots isn't the name of this video. And here's a tip for you to prevent pots inside of pots. If we add a bounds modifier and debug it, you can change the size of these points to match the size of our pots. Then with a self-pruning node, it'll just remove any overlapping points. Then just add a transform node and a static mesh spawner. But look, our pots are all facing up and I want them tilted to the side. So hit them with a 90-degree min-max X-axis rotation, drop in a little Z offset to set them down, spin them with some 360-degree rotation on the other two axes, and if we want to add more pots to this setup, we'll need to take the Sensei Steve approach once again and filter our pot points in quarters, each with their own transform node with different offsets to account for the different pot sizes. Otherwise, they'd just be floating if we threw them into our one mesher. But this looks so nice. It's exactly the feel I'm going for, and I can just imagine how many rupees are in this field alone. And to close out our Roman PCG setup, I want to add rows of ancient columns to round things out. It's going to start out the same way as our ruins grids, with a density filter cranked super high. Each point equals a row of columns. From there, we'll come to a copy points node with a create points grid plugged into the target. And remember, we need to reproject the grid points back onto our landscape. From here, we can edit the grid points until we like what we see. Now, we want to randomly assign a handful of column meshes from the Quixel Megascans library to each one of these points. And because these columns are squared on the top and bottom, we need to employ that 90-degree snap technique once again. And look at that, it totally works. Now that we built the rules for our environment, let's see what it looks like when we expand its bounds. If you select your PCG volume in the outliner, you can press the cleanup button to pack it all up. Make sure your PCG volume encompasses the entire area, then all there's left to do is hit generate. I legit can't wait to create more environments like this. To me, it's the perfect blend of technical and visual artistry. I feel like this is what I imagined doing when I was a kid. If I can think it, I can create it. I'm excited to see what environment you create after this video. If you want to learn more about the wonderful world of PCG, I want to recommend some channels for you guys, because without them, I wouldn't have been able to make this video. I wouldn't have known how to do it. First off is Aziel Arts. His PCG tutorials are right up my alley and shows you how to create stylized PCG environments. He's got other videos on open world optimization and using splines to scatter meshes, just to name a few. Then there's Michael Royalty, who's just on a different level. He's making procedural Catan tiles, brick walls, PCG display screens. If you want to see PCG taken to the max, go check him out, as well as Procedural Mines. He built an entire building procedurally. He generated the whole back rooms. I just saw that he's got a video on that 90-degree snapping technique. I gotta go watch that. Oh my god. Y'all keep learning, keep growing, and have fun with PCG and Unreal Engine. I'll catch you guys soon. Peace.